And I have to step down since our permanent chair, Professor Tatiwasov, is here and his connection is restored. So thank you, everybody. And Sergey is the permanent chair.
Yes, thank you, Anton. I'm pleased to introduce our next presentation, Case on Floating Quantifiers in Russian Infinitival Clauses, a configurational analysis by Fyodor Baykov, Moscow State University. Fyodor?
Yes. Do you hear me? Do you see my presentation?
Yes, we can hear you very clearly, but we don't see your presentation.
Ah.
Instead, what we see is some sort of different screen. So what is projected is not your presentation.
Isn't it?
But there is something projected.
And now, do you see a different slide?
No, it's the same.
Just
the same. It looks like a browser window.
Just close the presentation and try to reload it.
Yes. Here it is.
Yes.
Thank you.
A whole different matter now. Yeah, welcome.
Thank you very much. So my name is Fyodor Baykov, and now I'm going to talk about case characteristics of floating quantifiers in Russian infinitival clauses. To begin with, what is a floating quantifier? It's a polynomial word such as sum or один, which is usually contained within a DP, which it modifies, but which can sometimes be dislocated from it, as for example in the sentence 1. And if a floating quantifier is inside an infinitival clause, and if it modifies the silent subject of this infinitival clause, two options regarding its case marking are logically possible, as Van Ork has argued. Namely, this floating quantifier can surface in the same case that the controller does, or it can take on different case value from that of the controller. The first situation is called case concord or case transmission, and the second one is called case independence. And now goals of my presentation. I am going to elaborate on the conditions under which each of previously introduced strategies is possible. For example, I am going to consider the question whether dative floating quantifiers are categorically impossible under exhaustive subject control. And I'm also going to examine the behavior of floating quantifiers under some previously unstudied subtypes of control, namely under such matrix predicates such as угораздить and тянуть or подмывать, and under idioms such as жаба душит or черт дернул. And I will check already established results from the literature against real usage data from the internet. As has already been argued, under usual direct object control, both accusative and dative floating quantifiers are acceptable. As you can see in examples from the internet in 3a with a dative floating quantifier and in 3b with an accusative floating quantifier. Now let's consider Podmyvat type verbs. These verbs, namely угораздить, достать, тянуть, and подмывать, take an accusative nominal argument and an infinitival clause whose subject is coreferential with the accusative DP. For example, as in example 4. And I argue that this accusative DP is a real direct object and not a quirky case marked subject, because sometimes a nominative DP is also present. For example, as in sentence I, when we hear меня черт угораздил and so on. And as the corpus data reveal, such predicates admit both accusative and dative floating quantifiers in infinitival clauses. So they behave just as the verb pопросить ask does. So in 6a, we have a dative floating quantifier самому, and in 6b, we have an accusative floating quantifier самого. But it should be noted that in all the examples which I have found, accusative floating quantifiers are located on the very left periphery of the infinitival clause. And so an alternative analysis, taking them to be situated in the matrix clause, cannot be excluded. This regards sentences such as 6b. Now let's proceed to idioms with direct object control, namely жаба душит, to feel jealous, and черт дернул to do something unwise inadvertently. Both these idioms take an accusative object and an infinitival clause, whose unpronounced subject is again obligatory coreferential with the accusative DP. And an example is provided in the sentence 7. And as it turns out, the floating quantifier contained within the infinitival clause has to take on obligatorily the dative case. And examples with accusative case were not found in the internet corpus and are considered severely degraded by all the native speakers whom I have informally consulted. So that we have a corpus example in 8a with a dative floating quantifier and a conceivable comparable example with an accusative floating quantifier, which would look like something as in 8b, was not found and is considered impossible by the native speakers. And now let's go to subject control. In many works, it has been argued that nominative floating quantifiers are the only option available under subject control. But Eden Landau in 2008 has argued that under partial as opposed to exhaustive subject control, dative floating quantifiers become acceptable. So, for example, we have 11a with exhaustive subject control, where nominative floating quantifier все is absolutely acceptable, and we do not have such a high acceptability with a dative floating quantifier. However, in 11b, we are dealing with partial control, and here we cannot have, as Landau argues, nominative floating quantifiers, but dative floating quantifiers become pretty much acceptable. And now we have another work which was written within a cognitive linguistic framework by Fortain in 2003. And in this work, many examples from published sources were cited with dative floating quantifiers embedded under such matrix subject control predicates as решить, decide, and норовить, strive for. For example, in C, we have a dative floating quantifier самому embedded inside the infinitival clause, which is itself embedded under the matrix predicate решил. And as the internet usage materials reveal, we can attest numerous examples with dative floating quantifiers even under exhaustive subject control, such as examples A to D. For example, in A, we have a dative floating quantifier самому, despite the subject control verb надеюсь, and for example, in D, we have a dative floating quantifier самому under matrix predicate ненавижу. In all these cases, however, we are dealing with exhaustive subject control because a necessary requisite for partial control is that the controller DP be semantically or even syntactically plural. But here we have both semantically and syntactically singular DPs, subject DPs, which are in many cases instantiated by silent little pro. And so there is not even a question about whether this control is partial or exhaustive. It's exhaustive. And despite that, we have dative floating quantifiers. But all the matrix predicates on the past slide were partial control predicates. That is, they admit partial control readings under some circumstances. But even with exhaustive control predicates, which never at all admit partial control readings, dative floating quantifiers can be found. For example, such predicates are isbegal, avoided, and natural began. Thus, it seems upon examining internet usage materials that almost any subject control predicate can concur with dative floating quantifiers. The only exception are modal predicates such as moch, can, and должен, must, and I should also note that dative floating quantifiers embedded under spectral predicates such as начать, or which, for example, we have in the sentence 14b, are admittedly extremely rare. And now let's proceed to main empirical generalizations. Here I try to synthesize my own work and the results are already established in existing works and sources. So under modal predicates, we can have only nominative floating quantifiers. Under other subject control predicates, we have, as I argue, both nominative and dative floating quantifiers. Under direct object control, we can have both accusative and dative floating quantifiers. And these direct object control predicates, with direct object control, we can have only dative floating quantifiers and not accusative ones, as I argue. And as is already established in existing sources, under oblique control predicates, such as попросить, ask at somebody to do something, or потребовать от, demand from somebody to do something, we can have only dative floating quantifiers. And under indirect object control predicates, we can have only dative floating quantifiers, but we cannot tease apart two options, namely the option of case transmission and the option of case independence here. Now let's proceed to my analysis. Firstly, I'm going to spell out all my assumptions. My analysis will be based on a variant of the dependent case theory, which is developed in the work by Mark Baker, namely in Baker 2014. I assume that the concrete morphological form of unmarked case assigned to ADP varies according to the domain where this nominal is located. And I argue that in infinitival clauses, the unmarked case is realized as dative. Moreover, following Baker 2014, I argue that both the unmarked and the dependent cases are assigned only when a CP phase is considered as spellout, and previously considered the command relations, namely those considered at the little VP stage, are not taken into account anymore. And if one DP, namely DPX, comments in another one, namely DPY, at the spellout of TP, that is when considering CP phase with respect to case assignment, then the lowest DP receives accusative case, and an illustration is provided below. What's my basic proposal? I propose that Pro and its controller cannot receive different case values when they are assigned case in the same phase. It's one another assumption, and moreover, I assume that infinitable clauses can vary in the amount of functional projections that they include. Some are CPs and others are mere TPs. And so, if an infinitable clause is a CP, its TP complement is considered with respect to unmarked case assignment, and then Pro gets dative case, and this dative case is thereupon transmitted to the floating quantifier. If, however, the infinitival clause is just a mere TP, then it does not form case assignment domain separate from the main clause on its own, and then the floating quantifier has to agree in case with its controller. Let's proceed to some details of my analysis, namely to case concord and subject control. Firstly, embedded little VP is assembled, then its complement big VP is sent to the interfaces, and nothing changes because cases, both unmarked and dependent ones, are assigned only when a CP phase is considered with respect to case assignment. Then a matrix little VP phase is considered, and we take at this stage into account the secondary relationship between pro and the object of the infinitival predicate, and once again nothing happens. And at the third stage, matrix CP phase is assembled, and its TP complement is considered with respect to case assignment as spell out. Then we have some new secondary relationships, namely the matrix subject secommands both pro and the object of the infinitival predicate. And then the highest nominal, namely the matrix subject, receives unmarked nominative case. The object of the infinitival predicate receives dependent accusative case, and pro receives the same case as its controller does, namely it receives nominative, which is thereupon transmitted to the floating quantifier. And case concord under direct object control can be dealt with comparably, but I have no time to go into all these details. Now, what's supporting evidence for my analysis? Examples with dative floating quantifiers under subject control are known to ameliorate if the infinitival clause is separated from the main one by a pause, or when this infinitival clause is extraposed, as in example 21, and the matrix clause contains a pronominal-like element, namely одного, one, referring to the entire infinitival clause, as Alexander Letucci has suggested to me. And in these circumstances, the infinitival clause is, informally speaking, less tightly connected with the matrix one, and so we may suppose that it includes more functional projections, being a full-fledged CP and not just a mere TP. Moreover, propositions, that is CPs, can be turned into nominals, and they are like nominals in that they can be referred to by proforms, and TPs cannot. And moreover, we, as I have argued, in many cases, both case transmission and case independence are equally acceptable options, or at least that's so for some speakers. Most control predicates can be said to take as their arguments both CP and TP infinitivals. And such subcategorizational indeterminacy naturally leads to adoption of the notion of disjunctive selection proposed by Bruning in 2019. Namely, model predicates can select only for TP infinitivals, and most other subject control predicates, as well as direct object control predicates, can select for both CP and TP infinitivals. While, for example, direct object control idioms select only for CP infinitivals, as do oblique control predicates. So my main conclusions are that dative floating quantifiers are attested under subject control, including exhaustive subject control, which many existing works claim to be impossible. And floating quantifiers under Podmyvat type verbs behave just in the same way as under usual direct object control, while floating quantifiers have to surface in dative case under matrix idioms with direct object control, such as жаба душит or черт дернул. And these facts are compatible with a dependent case theory analysis, which of course is not to claim that an analysis based on classical case theory, for example, as that in Chomsky 2000, is incompatible with these facts. it's all I have to say. Thank you for your time. That's all.
Thank you, Fyodor. The paper is open for questions and discussion. The first question came from Irina Burukina.
Yeah, hi, hello. Thank you so much for the great talk. I'm really happy to see that you've collected all this wonderful data and you show that the variation is enormous. Okay, so I have 3 comments very quickly. So first, I was wondering whether there is some correlation, because you say that, well, in this case we have a CP, in this case we have a TP. So are there any other properties in parallel that can demonstrate that? Because, for example, I remember this paper by someone about like NPIs, for instance, being licensed over the TP boundary, but not over the CP boundary. So it would be really great if you could show that there is some correlation between your facts and some other CP boundary related facts. So when you have like dative floating quantifier, you have CP boundary and you cannot have NPIs licensed, for example, or something like that.
Yes, thank you for your question. I know about these works. I have tried to establish some correlations. At present, I have not established rigid correlations because these works which I have consulted assume that subject control leads to TP infinitivals, and we cannot have a CP infinitival under subject control, which my analysis is incompatible with such a position. But I'll try to establish maybe some other correlations or maybe something like that. I will think about that once again.
Yeah, and I'm slightly worried about the type shift because I'm not very well familiar with this Bruning's paper that you referred to, but I always had this like idea that TP and CPs, that they have different semantic types, for example, and that when your predicate selects for a TP, it means that it selects for a particular semantic type, right? Basically. So here you now have predicates that have this sort of free alternation. So they can select either a situation or a proposition. And I'm slightly worried about this freedom, so to say. So
yes,
maybe you can say something about it, or I don't know.
No, I haven't thought about semantic considerations relating to semantic type and type shift, but maybe it's a very good point. Thank you.
Yeah, and the final note, you had this really nice fact about idioms, right? That idiomatic matrix predicates turn out that they, for some reason, select only TPs, right? If I remember correctly. Because
no, just CPs, because they're dative.
Just CPs, yeah. Just CPs. So it would be really nice if you can come up with some maybe explanation for why all idiomatic predicates behave like that, because they seem to form this like natural class. I don't know, and it's really interesting. It's really nice.
Yes, at present I can't explain why idiomatic predicates behave in this particular way. I don't know. Maybe infinitival clause has to be something bigger than just a mere TP, and I just can't explain this because it's mere informal intuitions and not a full-fledged formal analysis.
But it's really great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mark Baker, please.
Yes, thank you. I enjoyed your presentation too, and having followed some of the literature on these things before, it's nice to get a fuller empirical picture. I have 2 comments from the point of view of the dependent case theory part of your analysis, since that's kind of what I know. The first is I was interested in your proposal that infinitives have the unmarked case as being dative at the spell out. And to me, this raises the question of whether infinitives are different categories from like finite CPs or not. So in the cases that we know of where you have different unmarked cases, there's a clear category difference to hang it on. So like genitive is the unmarked case in noun phrases, and nominative is the unmarked case in clauses. Maybe partitive is the unmarked case in VPs and Finnish, and so on. But here, I suppose you'd still want nominative to be the unmarked case in finite CPs, whereas you've argued that dative is the unmarked case in non-finite CPs. So then the question is there more of a category difference there than we're used to? Or can these case rules be triggered to subcategorial features of some kind, you know, different subtypes? And then I think the question arises, how fine-grained can those category differences really be? So I'd be, that's a comment more than a question, but I would be interested in any reactions you have to that.
Yes, thank you very much. I can just say that there exists an analysis according to which genitive is the unmarked case in Russian nominalizations. It's just one of the analytical options, of existing analytical options, and there is a well-known observation that proposes to somehow relate infinitival T or infinitival C in Russian to assigning dative case, and all the finite versions of these functional projections of these functional heads are known to assign nominative as expected in finite clauses. So it's just like this, and I think that more typological work is needed to answer a question as to how fine-grained can be these features, these feature values.
Good. I guess that clarifies it, but I have a short follow-up that I think it is true that there's an analog between the idea that, say, non-finite T assigns nominative case, dative case, and dative case is the default case within a TP. If we allow it to, if we allow the default case to vary with not only the category of the head of the clause, but the, you know, the actual lexical features of it, then I think the difference between unmarked case and case assigned by a head begins to blur.
Yeah, maybe it's so.
It's not necessarily a bad thing, but then, you know, two ideas that started out distinct are maybe starting to converge. We've got to think about that a little bit.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank